Ah, there's another error.
Oh, damn it. Well, yeah, that must have been ChatGPT or me reusing the slides of the last one.
Exactly.
AI checker. Also, I guess that all the companies are trying to pivot to AI, so probably quite a few people have home incentives to develop anything where AI is included in the document.
Anything where at least you can say AI.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
But there is quite a bit of research on AI for networks and networks for AI. Say it again.
Hmm.
I can guarantee that that's not completely true, but I cannot reveal my sources. Yeah, I know that there is quite a bit of networking inside of the data center to train models in a more efficient manner, and I that's real. But I my level of expertise on the topic is not sufficient to go much further than that.
I think we should.
Yeah, I think we should get started, right? Well, hello everybody. Good morning. Hope everybody had a good ITF. I see a few of us have survived to make it to the morning of the last session. So welcome everybody to Rasprg Research Group, Research Analysis of Standardization Processes, which is now a permanent research group. First, the note well and intellectual property. As you know, the IRTF follows the ITF intellectual property rights for disclosure rules, and that by participating in the IRTF, you agree to follow the IRTF process and policies. If you are aware that any IRTF contribution is covered by patents or patents applications that are owned or controlled by you or your sponsor, you must disclose it or not participate in the discussion. The IRTF expects you that you file such IPR disclosures in a timely manner. The IRTF prefers that most liberal licenses terms possible are made available to the IRTF stream documents, and definitive information is in the relevant RFCs. So please check that if that's a matter for you. Note also that there are audio and video recordings. IRTF routinely makes recordings of online and in-person meetings, including audio, video, photographs, and publishes those records online. If you are participating here and you are not wearing the red "Do Not Photograph" lanyard, then you are consenting to appear in such recordings. And if you speak in the microphone, appear on a panel, or do anything in any official manner, you are consenting to appear in the recordings. If you participate online and turn on your camera or your microphone, you are consenting also to appear in such recordings. As a participant or attendee in any IRTF activity, you acknowledge that writing audio, video, photographic records of meetings may be made publicly available, and personal information that you provide to the IRTF will be handled in accordance with the privacy policy of the ITF, which you can find online. As a participant or attendee, you also agree to work respectfully with other participants, and if there is any issue on that matter, please contact the Ombudsman team. And you can also check the relevant RFCs. Note also that the goals of the IRTF is not a standardization. The IRTF conducts research and is not a standards development organization, and the appropriate RFC can give you more details on that note. And from the general to the specific, RASP is about understanding the standardization processes via standardized based reproducible work. The goal of the outputs, the goal is to produce outputs, which are joint reports, papers, tools, data, open source software. It is not the goal to do hierarchical comparisons between SDOs or directly influence ITF operations, though it's absolutely fine if the ITF decides to have any inputs from here to direct their operations, or if people find that the things from other SDOs are relevant to the ITF. The chairs are Álvaro Retana and myself, Ignacio Castro, and you can find all the information in the website of the group. Of course, join the list and share information there. The house rules, please scan the QR code. If you have not done so, please do it now. We need that for knowing who is in the room, and you will need that also to make questions. For the speakers, please get ready before the previous speaker is preparing the Q&A. And now is the part that everybody loves, and is finding a volunteer to take notes. Thank you very much, Rio. Really appreciate it. So can someone volunteer to take notes while Rio is presenting? Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Can you say your name for the record? Thank you. So we have what is hopefully a very interesting agenda. So we have first Justus Baron on the role of geography for participation in standards development, with particular insights for the IETF. I believe he brings economics angle, which is his area of expertise. So I hope that's going to be a refreshing view, given that very frequently we are coming from the same networking background. Then we'll have Rio Janajita exploring SDOs through open data, so the streams, tools, and code, which hopefully will bring quite a few insights on how we can crunch data from the data tracker to derive insights that are useful for the community and the IETF. Jaime Jimenez will continue on that line with automating AI IETF insights generation with AI, which allows him to produce automatic reports using data tracker and LLMs. And then Kalija Young will join us remotely to present her findings from exploring the remarkable generative patterns of the IETF, a project that she has recently finished. And with that, Justus, if you want to come to the front, I will share your slides.
I need to use the microphone.
Yes, please.
And can I have this for the?
Yes, you can. Actually, it would probably help if I keep this here.
I use the time to say hello and good morning. Thank you very much, Ignacio, for reaching out and suggesting that I present my work at this meeting. I'm not an expert on IETF by any means, but I have studied standards organizations for. Oh, yeah, the camera is going to show you. I'm sorry. So should I get a chair or stand here? Okay, I just stay here. Sorry. Okay, thank you for the suggestion. Okay, no, that's fine. That's great. So you can tell I'm new, so I'm discovering. So as I said, I'm not an expert in IETF, but I have been studying standards and standards development organizations for about 15 years. And in this presentation, I start from a paper that I have been working on together with Tatiana Rosa for almost 2 years now on the geography of standardization, which is focusing on 3GPP. But given that I was invited to speak here, I thought it's appropriate that I do some replication work. And I will try to focus as much as I can in this presentation on research that I just did this week for replicating some of these findings in the context of IETF and getting some additional new insights out of this. So on a, this doesn't seem to work. So next slide, please, if that's possible.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so on a general level, the research topics that I'm gonna tackle today, there's an intersection between 3 large themes and topics, which I believe might also be relevant for this group. So the first is the general theme of the geography of standards development. So recently there has been quite a lot of writing and talking about the resurgence of geography and standards, much of it in the context of global south versus global north, or like the geopolitics of standards and so on and so on. But there's also like a more narrow role of geography, meaning there's just the role of distance and borders for individuals' ability to participate in in-person processes of standards development organizations. And barriers to participation generally, and including these geographical barriers, are important for the diversity, for the openness, and for the balance of standardization processes. And specifically since COVID, which has changed many processes of work generally, but also standardization processes, there's a new angle of this research, which is better understanding the different merits and the different roles of hybrid and in-person participation, and how this vastly expanded role of remote participation interacts with some of these factors that I'm going to talk about. So the next slide, please. The next topic that this is going to address, and my work at IETF that I did very recently is even more strongly emphasizing that, is the importance of gender in standards development. So in many standards organizations, including IETF, but also through GPP, there is a very small share or representation of women in standards organizations. And the higher you go in the hierarchical level of these organizations, the lower that share tends to become. So at chair levels, or in the context of CGPP, technical specification group plenary level, in IETF, in area directors or chairs, or the IAB, we see lower representation of women than in the general attendee population. And obviously, this could be problematic for many different reasons. One aspect is potential lack of epistemic representation. So there are just perspectives that are missing in the room, but it's also simply a fact of denied career opportunities for women in many organizations and contexts. And to be clear, we do not, there's nothing in the work that suggests that this is something that the organizations themselves have produced, but it might just be something that reflects factors that are at play in the workplace or even in families, and we get to that. Next, please. And then finally, the third general topic is the topic of the governance of standards organizations. In particular, like the factors, the attributes of standards organizations that make them worthy of trust, that make society trust that these organizations are appropriately balancing different considerations and checking the powers and influence of certain powerful stakeholders. And one aspect of that is individuals and their network and their concern for their reputation in their network of peers, which is a potential counteract to external influences over the organization, but that also leads to interesting and complex interactions between individuals' incentives and the incentives of their sponsors or affiliations. And each of these topics leads to these research questions. Next slides, please. I'm sorry. Okay, I should also mention that there are prior work that directly leads to this. So one work that has specifically focused on IETF together with a group of co-authors, we looked at factors that lead to or that might explain persistent lack of women in IETF leadership positions. And we looked specifically at the selectorate, at the nomination committee, and we find that there's no obvious correlation between the female share in NomCom and the share of females among individuals appointed to leadership roles. Only in recent years, there is a correlation that becomes significant and positive, which we interpret as potential evidence of a norms change. But overall, important for today is that there's relatively scant evidence that it's the selection process or the characteristics of the selectorate that can explain the relatively stark pattern of underrepresentation of women in higher organizational levels. Sorry, next slide, please. And another element of prior work on the governance of standards organizations, this time that focuses on IETF and 3GPP together with Olya Kanevskaya. We studied factors that can explain or contribute to explain appointments of individuals to leadership positions in 3GPP and IETF. And we find there's this very strong overrepresentation of certain nations and certain affiliates of certain organizations in these leadership positions. But we find a causal affiliation, a causal effect of affiliation with the top commercial stakeholder and chair appointments actually only at IETF. But, and also importantly for us today, in both organizations, it's the individual experience and expertise that is the predominant causal factor for appointment, and specifically its high, regular, persistent frequency of meeting participation. So, which goes to this idea of this interpersonal, trans-organizational interpersonal networks. Frequent in-person participation is important for individuals' ascension in the SSO community. Which then leads to the questions for today. Next slide, please. It's so what is the role of geographical distance for in-person participation at SSO meetings at 3GPP, but also and specifically today at Ietf? And then how are different types of individuals differently impacted by these geographical barriers to participation? And what I believe is new and particularly relevant at Ietf is what is the impact of the option to participate in all these meetings remotely? Is that a door opener that reduces barriers to participation, or is that something that also potentially can crowd out direct in-person participation with potential ambiguous effects? And not today, but further down the road in this research project, also understand what are the different payoffs, the different consequences of in-person and remote participation. And then next slide, please. So I'm going to start by presenting the findings of the existing paper on 3GPP. So what we did in that work is we created a large database with information on individual attendees. So overall, there are almost 7,000 individuals and their decision to participate or not in 35 different working groups, and specifically in the 2,264 in-person meetings of these working groups. And we produce data on these individuals' characteristics, including their standardized names, the company that they represent at the meeting, and the role that they hold in the meeting, whether they're, for example, a chair or not. And then we use the contact phone number and the area code or country code in that phone number to infer where these individuals reside, like their country and region of origin. And from that, we calculate then the distance between their place of residence and the place where the meeting takes place. And we not only observe the people that are actually in the room, the attendees, but we also observe the at-risk attendees, the people that we thought could have been in the room. We do that by looking at all the people that participated in one previous meeting over the last 2 years. This is kind of the at-risk population that could, based on their past participation, have been interested in participating in this meeting, and then we check whether these people participate or not. Next slide, please. So what we see in terms of the population of the attendees over time, we see that the population is relatively stable over time. We see that there's significant shifts and changes in the geographical composition, in particular Chinese and other Asian countries, their participation strongly increases over time. But we see that in the gender composition is relatively stable. The only reason why the share of women increases over time is because there are more Chinese women than men compared to other countries. And like the share of women among Chinese is higher than for other countries. And given that the Chinese share increases over time, that raises the share of women. But among US or European participants, the share of females is stable over time. Next slide, please. And then the perhaps the core finding is the effect of distance on participation in person participation. So what we do see is distance matters. The further the meeting is away, the lower is the likelihood that an individual chooses to participate. The same is for whether the meeting takes place in the same country in which the individual resides. That significantly increases the likelihood that the individual attends. And interestingly, this border effect, the same country effect, continues to be significant even if you control for the general effect of distance. Next slide, please. And we also find that over time, the effect of distance gradually declines. So distance becomes less and less important over time, over this 20 years time period that we track, but not borders. So the same country effect continues to be significant at a constant level over time. Next slide, please. And now looking at this gender effect, we find that women are particularly elastic to distance, meaning that a woman's decision to participate in a 3GPP meeting is more strongly affected by how far away from home this meeting takes place. And that is not true for this border effect. So it's the physical distance, but it's not the fact whether the meeting takes place in the same country in which the individual resides. Next, please. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. They look so similar. Okay, and the other heterogeneity in effect that I find is that it's only the individuals of smaller stakeholders that are actually affected by distance. So if we only focus on affiliates of the 10 largest organizations in 3GPP, which account for 50% roughly of the attendance observations, then these individuals are not affected by distance at all, which is actually quite remarkable. It doesn't matter whether the meeting takes place at the other end of the world or is close to your home. This has zero effect on your likelihood to participate if you work for one of these top stakeholders. But so it's the smaller, less engaged stakeholders that are actually affected by distance. And then next slide, please. And we can also look at other individual characteristics, in particular the seniority, which is measured as just the time elapsed since the first time somebody participated in 3GPP. And what we see here is that more senior people are generally less elastic to distance. So if you have spent a lot of time in 3GPP, then you would you're generally attend fewer meetings. Like overall, your decision to attend a meeting is negatively affected by seniority, but the effect of distance on your decision to participate becomes less and less important. Okay, and that doesn't matter whether you're man or woman, and there's no difference between men and women in this regard. Next slide, please. And something that is particularly relevant at 3GPP and perhaps less so at Ietf is the fact whether an individual is a patent inventor. So the very large majority of attendees in 3GPP meetings are listed as inventors of patents in the related technical field. In the context of 3GPP, this is probably a valid measure of technical expertise. And we find that the more patents an individual has invented, or the higher the number of patents on which an individual is listed as inventor, the higher is the likelihood that that individual attends a meeting. But also it's the effect of distance becomes less and less pronounced. So we can interpret that a highly expertise, an individual with significant expertise in a particular technical field, if there's a meeting related to his expertise, his or her expertise, then that individual would choose to participate no matter what. And or maybe the employer of that individual so deeply cares about the fact that it is specifically this individual that participates in the meeting, as opposed to a less expert individual that might be located closer to the meeting, so that they would choose to send the employee from that particular office, even though that office is by no means the closest office to where the meeting takes place. So this might be, this substitution effect within the organization might explain why more senior individuals, but also like more technically expert individuals are less sensitive to the effects of distance than more junior or less expert individuals. So it's not on the slide, but it's something that we also checked, whether these other individual characteristics can explain the differences between men and women that we observed. So it is true that women on average are younger in 3GPP. They have spent less time in 3GPP than men. They have invented fewer patents. They're listed on fewer patents as inventors than men. They also are less likely to work for a top 10 stakeholder than men. So all these characteristics which we have seen are correlated with a higher elasticity to distance. But even if we control for all these other effects, then we still find this persistent effect that for whatever reason, females have a higher elasticity to distance. It matters more for them whether the meeting takes place far away than for men. So now let's turn to IETF. So we're basically discovering these results together because I've been working on that very intensively the last few days in order to be able to present this today in this group, because I thought it's appropriate to do so. The data that I'm looking at here is general attendance data at the IETF meetings. So and I have data from meeting 29 to 105. So it's a bit dated now. And I would argue that this is positive because similar as for the 3GPP data that I just presented, this is not affected by COVID. So all this is pre-COVID, which changed so many things at the same time that it makes things a little bit difficult to interpret. It's obviously very interesting to return to that post-COVID data at some point, but here we are looking at the pre-COVID period and we can interpret the results independently of all these shocks and all these things that happened that we all still vividly remember. And what we see at IETF, what I think is really interesting, which we didn't have to worry about at 3GPP, is over the last decades, there is an increasing relevance, an increasing share of remote participation, which obviously strongly interacts with this role of distance. There is an option to participate without having to travel, which is obviously more interesting if that distance is particularly far away. Next slide, please. So similar to the previous project, it's a heavy data-intensive project with a lot of name standardization. Similar to the other project, it uses individuals' first names to identify their gender. Different from the previous project, most of the time we do not have the phone number. So what we instead use is the stated country of the individual as a proxy for residence, which I believe is even less perfect than the phone number. But I mean, obviously, we expect that there should be sufficient correlation to still be able to interpret the results. And we have a much larger number of individuals, but fewer attendance records, which I think is kind of representative of differences between these organizations. So it's a larger group, but less exacting travel schedule. So there are fewer meetings per year to attend, at least with respect to this organization alone. Okay. And some comparisons with the previous data. On average, on-site participants at an IETF meeting travel a little bit less than 3GPP attendees, which can be due to many different reasons. What it is not due to is that the population of attendees would be less scattered around the world than in the case of 3GPP. So this is not the case. What drives the difference is that there's a bigger difference between how far the people who are in the room travel to be in the room and how far people who chose not to be in the room would have had to travel. So there's like a higher elasticity to distance in the case of IETF compared to 3GPP. In simpler words, distance matters more for people's decision to participate in an IETF meeting than it matters for an individual's participation decision at 3GPP. One of the reasons contributing to that, but absolutely not alone, not sufficient to explain the difference on its own, is the fact that there is this option of remote participation. As you can see, the people who choose to remote participate, they live even further away than the people who choose not to participate at all. So this is really an option that is particularly picked up by people who just live very far away from the meeting, but they are otherwise generally interested in the meeting.
Sorry, the distances?
Sorry, yes?
Is it 5,000 or 57,000?
It's 5,000.
Okay.
5,000 kilometers, 5,700 kilometers on average is a travel distance that every individual had. I'm not sure what the statistic would be today if we take the poll, but I mean, on average, people traveled 5,700 kilometers to attend an IETF meeting.
One or two way?
One way. It's the distance between the residence and the meeting location. Next.
Questions? You
He's the boss.
I just wrap up 2 more minutes so the share of females in the population is even smaller than at 3GPP. So in total, it's 11.5% of the attendees are female. There is a gradual but very slow increase over time. So the latest observations, we are at 13.8% in 2015. What's more is the women that are in the data, they attend fewer meetings. So it's not only that there are fewer women, but also on an individual level, per individual, we find that one woman on average attends 3.2 meetings, whereas men attend on average 3.7 meetings per individual. And this is not due to seniority. It's not due to the fact that the share of women increases over time and therefore they had less time to attend meetings. It is that similar to the previous, we do this at-risk analysis. So like its previous attendees, do they choose to participate again at the next meeting? Women's likelihood to participate in the next meeting is 17% lower than men's likelihood to participate. So next slide. And what we find is that this is actually due to distance. That can be entirely explained by distance. Then women are more elastic to distance, similar to what we find in 3GPP, even more so than we found in the case of 3GPP. So these are odds ratios, so you can interpret that in a particular way, these numbers. It means that we see this 18% difference. Women are 18% less likely to attend than men on average. But if the meeting takes place in the same country in which the individual resides, then this adds 23% to women's likelihood to attend compared to men. In other words, among two individuals living in the same country in which the meeting takes place, women and men have the same likelihood to participate on site. So it's only driven by the possibility or the decision to attend remote meetings that are far away. The same with distance in kilometers. And for the purpose of time, I just want to move to the last slide and then take questions. Women are more likely to take advantage of the possibility to attend remotely. And this is already the case in general. So women are, this is conditional upon participating at all. Women are 22% more likely to participate remotely. Overall, of course, if the meeting takes place in the same country, that likelihood goes down very significantly. People are much more likely to choose to participate on site if it's taking place in the same country. But if it's, but yeah, overall, like it's the likelihood for a woman goes down even much more if it's in the same country. So the fact that the meeting takes place closely has a stronger likelihood, has a stronger impact on a woman's decision to participate than on a man's decision to participate remotely. So what this, in a nutshell, to wrap up, what we find is that on-site participation in standards meetings is elastic to distance at Ietf, even more so than at 3GPP. This particularly impacts women compared to men. Actually, this difference can fully explain why, on average, women attend fewer Ietf meetings than men. And women are particularly more likely to take advantage of the opportunity to participate remotely. It's not that women have lower preference for on-site participation. If the meeting takes place closely, they are just as likely as men to participate on-site. But this distance, this elasticity to distance is stronger. So we interpret that as, or I interpret that for now as this possibility of remote participation is kind of double-edged. It reduces barriers, but at the same time, it also further increases disparities in who actually shows up in person to the meeting. So with this, I...
Thank you very much, Justus. We have a number of questions, so if people can please go ahead to make their questions. Appreciate it if these are succinct and more of a question than a comment, so we can give room for everybody to make their question. Stefan, I think you're the first. And then it's Andrew.
Stefan Bartsmeyer, I think. One question of methodology about the distance. When there was the Ietf meeting in Buenos Aires, there were few people attending because of the problem of price and availability of flights. I observed that, for instance, for me from France, it's much cheaper and easier to go to Singapore than to Buenos Aires, even if Singapore is much farther away. So it can be technically difficult, but maybe you should evaluate distance, not in kilometers, but on price, on the number of flights.
Yes, that's a great point. Thank you very much. So in the 3GPP project, we spent a lot of work trying to understand the mechanisms. And one of the mechanisms we looked at was the price, whether it's actually a monetary effect. So it's very imperfect what we did, but like we find that, for example, interacting distance with the oil price didn't have any effect. So I'm actually skeptical that the effect of distance that we see is driven by monetary considerations. I think there are so many other costs, opportunity costs of travel, the time it takes, the hassle, which actually seem to be mattering more, at least in the case of CGPP, than the financial cost of travel itself. But I mean, I acknowledge that we don't have really good data on all these actual costs of traveling. What is actually driving this reluctance to travel that needs to be studied much more.
For the Buenos Aires meeting, the hard data is the number of participants, which was very low. And there's been a lot of discussion about the reason. And apparently the biggest one was the price of the But what is certain is that there were few participants in this meeting. It was a very low participation meeting.
But also the distance, the average distance obviously was high. I mean, like it's like compared to what, But I understand your point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next is Andrew. I guess that it's quite interesting that a flight routing in a networking conference would be in a networking event. It's a good way of measuring, because I guess that it's not just the distance or the price, but the hassle and the number of hops you need to take, and the availability of flights might matter more than price itself.
Hi, sorry. Hi, Andrew Camping. Really interesting research that's being done. Is the cutoff point you had for the IETF data was unfortunate in a way, because from what I recall, our remote access tooling around 105 was still fairly primitive. So the remote experience wasn't as great. It would be interesting to see what, if any, changes happened since the tooling's got a lot better. So my question then is, do you have any plans to look at the more recent data? Because that'd be good to see if you do.
Yeah, thank you very much for that input. I was not aware of that particular improvement, but overall, I think we're all aware that possibilities of remote participation in meetings have dramatically improved in recent years. And that obviously is an important factor. As I said, it's such a compound change. So many things happened at the same time, with an economic crisis, with, I think a lot of it is conflicts in the home place, that people can't travel because they have to take care of kids, for example. And that also happened in COVID, that it's for a year kids were at home, So it's so many different things changed at the same time, that it's an entire research project on its own to try to disentangle all these different effects at the same time, because you wouldn't be able to individually attribute any kind of change that happened at that period of time to one of these different things that happened, because so many things happened at the same time. But it's definitely on the plan, is to try to dig into how the world now is different from the world that is in our data pre-2019.
Thank you.
Jaime Jimenez. So distance is a great proxy for cost. So in a way, it's taken into account. So that just a small comment on that. And then on the slides, you mentioned that you did a lot of data normalization for participation. I have done the same thing, probably worse, for my work. And actually, it'd be good to look into how to pre-normalize this type of information already on the IETF records. I wonder, maybe just like we retrieve it. I guess you were using rsync data from the IETF, I suppose. But it would be nice, I don't know if it's a question or more like a comment, if IETF could help on the pre-data normalization, because this kind of problem, I guess it arises for everybody. Sorry. What do you think about that, by the way?
That sounds great. I mean, I'm more than happy not to have to do it again. I mean, in full transparency, I just went to the website, the public attendee list from the IETF website, and I took that. And then it's the name harmonization is based on email addresses to the extent they are available, and then like it's just like
Okay, then for your information, in rsync, you have way more information, more data. You can also correlate it with authorship of drafts, RFCs, and that type of information, and also all minutes. I mean, we can go into that later, but formalizing all that would be great. Thanks a lot for the presentation.
Carolina.
Hi, everyone. So here you have the woman, the one woman in the queue participating remotely. So just thank you so much for that presentation. I just, wanted to say we're currently discussing at IETF, questions relating to the selection of venues. I think we were also actively discussing questions of gender diversity. Even, this morning at the EODIR, which is the Education Outreach Directorate Coordination Group, we were discussing the experience of remote participants, and I think your research would be, I can think of a lot of people in leadership that should be exposed to some of your findings to help decision making. I did have a question about the NomCom data that you mentioned. You said that you had found that female participation in the NomCom was not impacting the selection of women to leadership positions, but that you did see that sort of changing towards, I guess, the latter historical data that you've collected. So I was wondering whether you could comment on that a bit more, because I was surprised that it didn't have an impact. And it may be that it has to do with I don't know, your cutoff date or something as well, if you were collecting data up to 2019. The other thing I wanted to comment on just very quickly on sort of gender participation stats, whether there's any way that you could consider domestic responsibilities. You alluded to women being caretakers. And I think that has an impact in, I'm in my third trimester. That's basically the reason why I'm not, at IETF, in person. And I think that probably affects, other women's decision to attend events. And then on the Global South sort of participation, some people in the queue brought up the question of Buenos Aires. I'm actually Argentinian, and there was something very interesting happening that meeting, and that's that a lot of Argentinians didn't actually attend IETF, even though it did happen locally, and that had to do with costs, registration costs. People think that a couple $100 is not too much money to sort of invest, but that's the equivalent of the sort of average salary in Argentina. So basically making sort of the cost of attendance non-permitting, even if the event was happening locally. So I think there's also a question of cost to sort of unpack, especially when we're looking at Global South populations. I just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karina. These are great points. So on the first point on NomCom, so this is in this presentation was just part of the literature in a way. So it's not the same cutoff date because it's not the same data. Also in that project, we did have a lot of this specific data on individuals' past history in the mailing lists and all the different roles that they had in different working groups and so on. But so in that project, we had carried out a number of interviews, and some things that some of these interviews brought up is that there was, I believe, 2013 or so, a low point was reached in the number of appointments of females to leadership positions in IETF, which triggered for probably the first time, as far as I recall, explicit discussions about that. Why is it that IETF doesn't appoint women to leadership positions, even though there are many women in the population of attendees that have similar characteristics to men? And this discussion, we interpret that to be a norms change. So that that there is an explicit discussion about appointment of women to leadership position more so than it was ongoing before. And it is only in the context of this already existing awareness, of this already existing discussion, that having more women being randomly appointed into the nomination committee actually has an effect on how many women this nomination committee appoints. Because Obviously, in every nomination committee, in the data, women were always a minority. So it's never a majority of women that that makes these decisions. But for this bigger minority of women to actually have an impact on the decisions that the nomination committee makes, we interpret that it did make a difference, that there was this already explicit existing discourse that, okay, there's such a stark empirical underrepresentation of women in higher leadership positions. Why is that? So this is, but when I say like we do not find a correlation, that over the total period in general, there is no correlation at all. And even if you take into account this recent period where there is such a correlation, this correlation cannot explain much in terms of the variation in the number of women that get to leadership positions. So it's, I believe it's not primarily about the selectorate. It's really primarily about other factors that can explain these differences. With respect to the home place factors, I agree with you that this is, I am personally, even though I don't have any data right now to really back this up, but I personally believe that this is the strongest channel. And we have to do much more work to really disentangle the mechanisms to really understand between the company level mechanisms, because most of the time it's the employer that reimburses the costs. So like it might be just a decision of the employer to reimburse some people's costs more than others. It might be payoff, that for whatever reason, some participants get more out of their participation and therefore are willing to incur more opportunity costs to make that possible. Or it is just like it's conflicts or opportunity costs related to individuals' necessity to be home at a certain time. So these are kind of three different mechanisms. And I think out of these three mechanisms, I'm most firmly convinced that the third one is important. Yes, and Ignacio tells me to make
Ignacio and the time are starting to be of a matter of pressure. So Jonathan and Colin, if you can be succinct, we will make a reward for the person that produces the question and the answer with the least number of words.
So I definitely will lose this because I'm not good at doing few words, but I'll talk quickly instead. So I wanted to have two suggestions for how you could update, let's say, your cost function for travel. Because for me, the thing that really, really is painful when I travel is not distance per se, it's number of time zones. And like, if I'm going north-south, it doesn't make any difference. I can still stay in touch with people, like we can still do time zones, no problem. Time zones make it really, really painful. The other thing would be visas, because like one thing that comes up over and over again is whenever we have an IETF in America, in the United States, sorry, people are always like, well, all these people can't get visas, all those people can't get visas. So I think accounting for visa would be, I mean, I don't know how you would actually implement that, but that would be a very important factor. I'd be very interested if you could comment on whether in the most recent few IETFs, there's been on-site childcare. I'd be interested to know if that has had an effect or how we would tell if that's had an effect. And whether you looked at, there are some examples of people changing gender whilst they started attending the IETF as one gender and they still attend as a different gender. Does that affect their participation rates in the same way, or is it counterbalanced by their seniority by attending for longer or whatever?
And sorry, but maybe Colin, you can make the question and you can try to answer both of them succinctly because we are heavily running over time.
Yeah, sorry for that.
All
So time zones is a great suggestion. We haven't done that. We'll look into that. On the visa, we have done work. The problem is that in the 3GPP project, it's the visa requirement per se would be eaten up by the fixed effects, we did work with a database of visa requirements where there's some within variation, so that a country now requires visa for nationals of a certain country that they didn't require before. There's very little variation in that, and that little variation has not been enough for us to get significant effects. On the gender versus sex kind of thing, we have a very, very imperfect proxy of gender, which is the first name, which is statistically correlated with gender. So I would be very hesitant to kind of go further in analyzing people's gender or sex or gender expression or whatever. I mean, this is delicate, and we just don't have enough data to really do that. And I think the only acceptable way of doing that would be to ask people, and we haven't done that. So.
Hi, Colin Perkins. I also suspect on that latter point, there's so few people involved that the statistics are not going to be particularly useful anyway. You can't draw many conclusions from two or three people. I was also going to mention childcare. That was supposed to happen in 2020, and of course got delayed because of the pandemic, and unfortunately now goes into the mix of things which will complicate the post-pandemic analysis. You mentioned that women attend fewer meetings in person. Did you correct for those? Did you account for women who, rather than attending in person, switched to remote attendance? Or was that in the analysis for whether they are then switching to remote attendance or not attending at all? And my final point was, the IETF actually has much more granular data on gender, geographic location of participants, and so on from the registration data and the data tracker. Some of this is public in the data tracker if you trawl through that, and so you might be able to get better data there. It might also be interesting for you to chat with the IASG and the LLC to see if they would be willing to make some of this data available, perhaps in an anonymized form or with appropriate safeguards for this sort of research.
Yes, thank you very much. So overall, I definitely take the point home that I need to look at the data tracker. And I mean, as I said, we discovered the IETF findings more or less together today. I mean, like the paper is on 3GPP. I thought it's good to do some work on IETF, but I need to do much more. I agree.
Thank you very much, Justus. Rio, if you can come and.
Thank you. All right. Sorry, I need to settle down my brain. I was like typing furiously just now to
Of course, yes,
clear my buffer. All right.
So Rio Yanagita works at University of Glasgow, and he's going to be talking about tools to explore a standards development process from the data tracker and other sources mostly. The room is yours.
Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Rio. I'm a postdoc at the University of Glasgow. I currently work with Colin Perkins, and on the SodaStream project, I work with Ignacio as well. And today I'm going to so the SodaStream project has been doing a bunch of these standards development process analysis. So today I'm going to show you sort of the tools that we developed, how we do these things through showcasing some of the data we got. There we go. Oh. There we go. Okay. So SodaStream project has been going on for a couple of years. I joined towards the end of it, so I think a bunch of interesting things had happened well before I joined. But ultimately, the project has been analyzing standards development organizations and its process. The SodaStream project has been doing this through the open public data collection and analysis. And over the years, the project has built tools to carry out these data collection and analysis. This talk's main goal here is to sort of present the tooling built over the years through the showcasing some of the examples of our findings. So first, we'll look at the documents and authors and messages. And we'll also show you some results from what's known as social graph analysis. And then I will then explain sort of how we did this, how we went about these, collecting and analyzing these data. And then we'll close with the ongoing future work and sort of challenges that we faced through this process. First, so the more sort of straightforward kind of analysis is looking at the sort of documents and authors and messages stats. So we would collect data through data tracker and do things like annual document stats, how many documents being published, or author stats, author affiliations, or annual messages and stuff through mailing lists and stuff. So these plots are useful to sort of gauge the big picture around how the activity changed over the years and sort of the overall trend to at the organization. Again, what I'm about to show you is just an example. These aren't the only stats, so please go and have a look at some of the publications for more. There's a QR code for this particular one that I took most of the examples from. So first of all, the very straightforward thing to sort of look at is how many documents has been published and how many authors have been involved in these documents. And over the last 20 years or so, what we've seen is we see some peaks and troughs, but what we see is a sort of a slight decline from that sort of peak to today in terms of how many documents have been published. And what we see with when we look at it against the authors, we see that there obviously quite a few authors have been, so more than one author is obviously involved in a document publication for most. And when we put that against the amount of emails that's been flying about in the mailing list, we see that, and well, in this case, we also have GitHub messages. But what we see is that over the years, actually, the messaging amount of messages that's exchanged over the mailing list hasn't declined all that much, but the number of documents seems to have had more impact over the years. So perhaps this is sort of telling us that maybe the coordination costs per document might be increasing. One of the things we hear, or at least I've been hearing at Ietf, is that people are sort of talking about, oh, we do XYZ on the GitHub, talk about GitHub issues, all that stuff. When we look at it from the overall pictures, as far as we can tell from the data that we could find, it seems that the amount of activities on GitHub is actually quite small. So on the left, what we see is the number of people on mailing lists and GitHub, sort of unique senders on these two messaging mechanism, and on the right is the actual number of the messages over the years. It seems that they're a bit more chatty on the sort of GitHub. So these are, but a number of people involved seems to be quite small, actually. When we look at the documents, published document authors, so like we can also look at things like affiliations that they had on those documents. And so this is the, so in this plot, we're looking at the top 10 affiliations all time within this time period and seeing the breakdown of it. And so here we see that over the years, so these are percentage of, so the breakdown of the affiliations of authors involved in the documents published in each year. So we see that around 29, 28, we see the Huawei starting to show presence, and as that goes on over the years, there's been sort of they sort of peaked and then shrunk a little bit, but they still maintained the presence. And as that happens, the other affiliations, the presence of other affiliations have also shifted. So there's a shift in the sort of the affiliations overall, and the overall sort of percentage of the top 10 sort of the affiliations occupied, the ratio that it occupies seems to be quite stable over the past 20 years or so. There's been sort of ups and downs, but remains just under 40-ish, 40%-ish. So now I'd like to show you the social graph analysis. So we built tools to analyze the sort of interaction sort of patterns over the years. So what we mean by that is, if somebody sends an email to the mailing list and if somebody else replies, that is counted as an interaction. So if we could use that to sort of build a graph, so like graph theory graph, to see how people interact, who they're interacting as, that sort of thing. This is quite useful to analyze see the patterns of interactions. And again, what I'm about to show you is not the only thing that was being done. Do have a look at the publication for more. So so as I said, we each node of the graph is the authors, and here every time somebody replies to that author, that adds an edge in the graph. And so that's the the x-axis here is the degree of those edges. And what we see here is that only 5% or so of authors back in 2000 interacted more than 25 people, whereas over the years, this seems to have increased up to almost a quarter by 2020. So perhaps this is telling us that over the years, the authors are talking to more people to do the work that they're doing at Ietf, which suggests that there are more perspectives involved, or there's more collaborations happening to do this work. And so overall, this is somewhat, to me, quite telling me that perhaps the interaction is a bit more diverse, perhaps. So, how did we measure any of all of these plots? So, as we know, we have the Ietf. Ietf has its authors and the mailing list to coordinate these activities, and the documents are produced. So we first collect the data from the data tracker and mailing list server. We get the authors from the data tracker, documents from the data tracker as well, and the emails from the mailing list server. And from the headers of the emails, we get the email senders. We also looked at GitHub repositories that was appointed from the documents or the working group websites. We collected the GitHub issues and comments from respective repositories. We also used the API to get the GitHub users that involved in these interactions. Once we take all this, the first thing we did was to do what's known as entity resolution. So people over time change things like email address, people change affiliation, people might have multiple GitHub IDs, or people change their names through the changes in their life. What we try to do in this process is to sort of figure out when you extract these informations individually, by looking at it individually, it's difficult to know what's who's who, but we try to trawl through these data to match up using different attributes to see the unique individuals in these data. Once we figure out that to the best of our abilities, we do the mapping against this person to the documents, person to issues and comments, and emails, and so on and so forth. Affiliation is another one of them that didn't quite fit in the diagram here. Once we do that mapping, we can then do the plots that we saw earlier with sort of the overall sort of stats, annual stats and stuff like that. But the other thing we then do is the social graph generation. And it's the step that I described earlier. If there's an interaction with two individuals over the emails or GitHubs, we create a new edge. And then through this process, we then get to that social graph stats that I showed you earlier. So there's been a bunch of code to do this. One of the things that on a project that we've started to do is to look at other SDOs. In this case, we have a little sneak peek of what we've done for W3C activities, and looking at how, so we've started looking at how people interact with these multiple SDOs. So are these people starting in one and moving to the other, or vice versa? Or are they always interacting with both, or are they kind of jumping back and forth? Or what kind of activities are they involved in with regards to the two different organizations? Perhaps are they talking about the same thing in the two spaces, or are they talking completely different things in two spaces? Or the other things we are looking at is the amount of activity. So are these people leaning to the one side or the other? Are they quite sort of equal to one another? And we've also been looking at things like the topic and sentiment analysis as well in these top emails and stuff. I'd like to conclude with a bit of a, sort of the challenges we faced. So first of all, when it comes to these data analysis, collection and analysis, fundamentally these data are quite messy. These are like manually inputted data by individuals, and sometimes it has sort of the formatting that breaks them. So like random new line and stuff, that these things all have to be cleaned up. There could be spelling errors. They could also be there could also be things like the granularity of affiliation. So like people could be like, oh, I'm from this particular branch of this organization, and then when you put that together, it creates a completely different organization when you just analyze it without normalizing these things. So these things are quite challenging. The entity resolution has been quite challenging. Again, matching individuals via their contacts and name change over time is actually quite tricky. Name itself, if the name itself is quite popular, you could easily sort of enter a situation where these two people have names and these two people have different email addresses, and how do we know these two people are the same? And you need additional thing to sort of tie them in. So this is not helped by the aforementioned sort of messy data issues, and these are in general a tricky aspect. Mapping different information across different SDOs are quite challenging as well. Again, these SDOs do different, they're governed differently, so they have different format of information or the different sort of amount of data, so granularity of data or the format of the data, and then and the definition to the terms, and then like matching these and then making a sensible sort of comparison is quite challenging as well. And again, these are not unique to us, right? These are sort of common issues to any sort of public data analysis like this. So please talk to us if you have any suggestion, tips, maybe potential collaboration and all that. And finally, as we mentioned, we've put some effort into doing some early work on the entity resolution. Maybe this research group perhaps might be interested if we were to share such code. So again, these tools that we built over the years, they're quite unique to, specific to these individual papers that we wrote. So then we don't have a sort of nicely packaged thing that we could just pop in. So as a first, I think might make sense to sort of start with one piece by piece, and then maybe we can start collaborating and stuff like that. So on the right, we have the URL to the project and GitHub org, and the QR code is pointing to the paper that I mostly took the plots from. So this is it for me, and let's open the floor for questions.
Thank you very much, Rio. Taking notes, sticking to time, and a nice presentation. That's quite a few things. Olaf.
Yeah, very nice presentation. Thank you very much. I understand you did the what happened, but do you have an intuition about the why? And then specifically, you showed sort of a decreasing number of authors, a constant level of constant level of email engagement and communication engagement, and a larger mesh of intercommunication.
Right.
Do you have an idea if and why these things are tied together?
Some of the papers I haven't showed you here talks about days between the draft and a publication, and that's also increasing. So again, there's more things needed to be done, and I don't quite have the intuition, but
May I share my intuition on this?
that would be
I-
very helpful.
I,
yes.
I think that your graph that says there's more people talking to each other usually takes a little bit longer to get to consensus if you
Yep.
just have many people talking to each other. So that would be my intuition, but I
Agreed. Yes.
Yes, I think a bit to that. Yes, that's one of the things we see. It takes more emails, it takes more drafts, it takes more time, like two or three times longer over a period of 20 years. So it looks like the overhead of producing at the IETF has increased over time. Maybe part of that is representation. I guess that one interesting thing would be to compare groups that are working on, let's say, relatively old protocols that are pretty much working on a problem solved versus new areas, or when new areas emerge, whether the dynamics are comparable to the older ones.
and whether the quality of the work that comes out is better.
If you have a metric for that, I would be very happy to hear about it.
Will, Southwest Grid for Learning. I also have a theory on it as well. I agree with you on the number of participants obviously increases the complexity.
Yep.
But I mean, I'm a software engineer. If you build something new, often that is easier than working with existing code bases. And I guess in this sense, we're talking about interoperability with existing standards. You know, the standards themselves have got to be built on top of what is already existing, and they are more complicated as the use cases get more granular. So I think that's probably a factor in why it takes longer and why there are less documents.
Yep.
And I also think there's an opportunity for you guys to work together, because the authorship on the mailing list probably also indicates their interest in participating, and probably their knowledge as well, which may indicate some extra factors in your data.
Thank you.
And there is another question from Laurent.
Hi, thanks for the work. Wondering in the correlation you were showing about the how much people collaborate, whether you have purely per individual or you correlate also to the affiliations, because that could also be an indicator. If you have the same organization, let's say in a working group, you may have less communication among multiple different, let's say, people, but it doesn't represent necessarily the correlation of how information circulates at the group level. I don't know if you are purely individual or you correlate also the connectedness of individual versus how they are affiliated.
In this particular plot, I believe we've only looked at, yeah, I think so. I think this is the one he's talking about. On this particular one, as far as I'm aware, we're just looking at authors and individuals. I'm not sure, have we done affiliation?
We have done some affiliation analysis mostly for documents, because in documents you have, you declare. We are doing some mapping of affiliations, but it's quite noisy, as you can imagine.
Okay. Just another thing, wondering if you managed to see, I mean, differences, for instance, if you take a certain topic or a competence, let's say security, which is a bit more transverse to maybe multiple groups beyond the security area, do you see that this may change the, I mean, the amount to which people communicate with more people in the IETF? I don't know if this is something you want to explore, if you have the information. It's an open question. And also if you manage to spot, if you have the data to spot differences between IETF and IRTF, do you see that, for instance, in IRTF, people are more chatty, discussing with much more people in perspective, or on the contrary, it's much more reduced to specific areas? So just maybe food for thoughts more than anything. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think we have that particular data. Again, I think it's interesting to look at.
Yeah, I think that this looks at the IETF. I recall we remove IRTF. I could be wrong. I do recall checking for mails that involve security, and they indeed were more transversal, which of course makes sense. And that's pretty much on time. Well, thank you very much, Rio.
Thank you.
Yes. This is the last one that I have.
Just grab the labels.
Yeah, because you also have. Ah, yes.
No, that's not mine.
Yes, yeah.
Somebody else's. That's the next one, actually.
Yes. Indeed.
All right. So, yeah, it's been a long week. I am a bit aphonic. I apologize if it sounds horrible. Contrary to the previous speakers, I am not working in this domain of analytics, of participation or things like that. In my case, this all started from a problem that I had as a chair of one of the working groups. Basically, I needed to know what was going on in the ecosystem. So I work in IoT. I'm co-chairing the core working group that does the constraint application protocol. There is about 18 working groups that are more or less related to the work we do, and it's simply impossible to know what is happening. So the normal approach before AI would be that I have to watch 18 hours of video or talk to the people and get a more or less like an impression from their point of view of what happened, see the minutes, which can be good or bad or maybe incomplete. So basically I thought of programmatically improving that. So with the scripting and with AI and using the ITF records. And then since I did it for 18 working groups, I might as well do it for 130 for the whole ITF basically. So that's what I did. I did this public, so I didn't publish anything. I did it for myself and I shared it with some people and they were interested. They appreciated it. And Nacho convinced me to present here. And then basically I wrote that short position paper with an appendix, with an example for ITF 119 as a way to share it with the community. In any case, this is not a professional thing. That's what I'm trying to say. Like it's a side project for me. Next slide. I can do it. So as I mentioned, I wanted to automate ITF working group report generation. I wanted to explore how well does GenAI do it. This was starting, I think, late 2023, and I finished by then pretty quickly, but there was no, some of the techniques that we have today were not available at the time. Hallucinations were way worse than today. And basically, I also have in my laptop some local models. So I use Olama, and I have local models that are quantized, and they have different context windows. So I wanted to try also locally how well do they perform. Again, try as in not a very professional analysis, but at least to get an impression of how well this works. And that's what I'm presenting. So the problem is the hallucinations. I guess we all know what hallucinations are for LLMs. It's a statistical, it's generating data in a statistical manner. So it's token-based, but it's not 100% reliable. There is several strategies that basically consist on checking the output and sending it back again to the LLM and do some sort of recursive process. There is also prompt manipulation. So apparently the way you query affects the output. Self-supervisioning, reasoning strategies are very popular nowadays. So chain of thought type of strategies. But the simplest, in my limited experience, the simplest and most effective mechanism is to have really good ground truth material that you pass to the LLM. And luckily in the ITF, we have this open record policy. So we have the email archive, the data tracker API, the GitHub, the rsync server, and now the YouTube as well for the video. I mean, I haven't gotten that far, but you also could use that. So in my case, I didn't use ITF mail archive, mostly because the discussions tend to be a bit vague sometimes on the topics. Sometimes are more detailed, but the IoT groups that we work on, they are using, are some of the heavy users of the issue tracker actually. So data tracker, I used it mostly for the current drafts. Again, the IETF GitHub, the issues in the GitHub are accessible. It's kind of working, but I didn't really finish that. But I think I will probably work on that as well. But the heaviest thing I use is the rsync server. Basically, you get everything, the proceedings, the slides, the minutes, the blue sheets, the participant list, you get it from the website. From the YouTube channel, you could get the video and get the transcripts, but in my experience, the transcripts don't really help in groups where you have a lot of non-native speakers like mine. So they confuse more than they help, like they get all the acronyms wrong, the names wrong, everything wrong. They get the general, the normal conversation, it works. So when it comes to the content of the drafts, a good thing, compared, for instance, with 3BP, in which they work with Word documents, there's a lot of binary files that are not easily consumable. The IETF, actually, the drafts are really good for that. They are plain text, or with HTML, you get tagged HTML, so you can, the LLM kind of is more precise with those tagging. You have semantic, I mean, you could pass it to RDF or some sort of semantic tagging, but it's not needed. Even the Markdown, so if the drafts are written in Markdown and then compiled to XML. In Markdown, you have these AASVG diagrams that actually LLMs seem to understand to some extent. So that was kind of surprising for me. So images, a language model can understand text images. And then you have common patterns as well, the interfaces, the message examples, request response interactions, and so on. So, and then also very importantly, many of these LLMs are already trained with all the RFCs, even the local ones, because the training data, like for instance, with Common Crawl, you have a large portion of the internet already indexed, and as part of that, the IETF RFCs are already there. So the kind of like context seems to be already there. And yeah, and I guess that affects also the tokenization process and the way the LLM internals work. Yeah. So what the workflow roughly implies data retrieval for the various sources, mostly rsync, as I mentioned already, rsync, and crawling IETF websites for the contents of each of the meetings, meeting minutes, participant lists, the drafts and agendas. The data pre-processing, that's actually quite tricky for the reasons that Rio already mentioned actually. So you need to normalize participant names, you need to remove duplicates, some names are repeated many times because they're very common. And you need to structure the data in a database. And I have initially had a CSV, and then for other parts I have a little SQL thing. But I mean, CSV works fine. Yeah, and you need to correlate things. For instance, I don't know, like in the attendees list, you have the overall participants of in the IETF, and then in the blue sheets you have the ones for that meeting. You need to correlate that and then homogenize it in one single database. At least that's how I did it. And then once you have all of that normalized and you have all the data and all the inputs, then you use the LLM. And then for that, you use it recursively. And initially I was using just plain RAG. So you need to create embeddings for the content because the context window is huge. So the usual thing with API calling. I had to customize some prompts to retrieve the structure output from the LLM because basically I was sending raw text to the LLM and I needed the output in some JSON structure. And then afterwards I explored, so as I mentioned initially, it's like a body of work of 18 working groups for me. So I needed to see correlations or things that are relevant in more than one working group. And for that, I was using Rasprg. So that creates, so you have all the embeddings in the lower layer, and on top of it, it creates an index and a set of other entities that summarize clusters of embeddings and gives you the subject, the object, or basically the entities that are participating. And then it also links back to the embeddings. And then once you have all of that, you start generating reports for each of the working groups and the output in LaTeX or Markdown. And then you need to do post-processing for error correction. Some of it with software, just remove these backticks or formatting issues, and then you need the human correction a little bit sometimes. So on the LLM side, so I use these ones. Basically, I was limited by the computer I have on the local models. So I mean, the claims. It's not a critique of the local models. It's more like a critique of the models that I can install and can run. So I'm pretty sure people that are way better than me modifying the model properties, increasing context windows and things like that would be able to work with local models more efficiently. But in my case, it was the API-based ones, the one that worked the best. Yeah, so I started with those. And then, yeah, some limitations. I didn't use chain of thought. Nowadays you could use it. Maybe that could be an interesting thing to use nowadays. Yeah, I already mentioned the transcriptions. GraphRag was good, but you need to index all the documents. That takes like a couple of hours. Yeah, and I didn't use the full extent of the GraphRag solution. So like, for instance, like you could have at the end of the summary another section about how it relates to other protocols, like the draft X in your working group actually was also discussed in these other working groups. These are the implications for these other drafts and that type of thing. So this is an example output that you get. So you get a bit of an attendance summary, an overview of who were the companies, attendees, the participants, and what were the discussion. I mean, it's not exactly the same for every working group, by the way, but I place this type of structure because that's the way I like it, because it's quick and I can get an idea of what happened. You get the accurate affiliation of the participants. If they have also a role in the IETF, like an AD or something, you also get that information. You get a very concise summarization that tends to be correct, which is the fundamental aspect here. What else? Like every now and then you get these kind of detours, and then yeah, invents some of the content, but is way less than by just grabbing the stuff and putting it on ChatGPT and saying, give me a summary. Like, it doesn't compare. Yeah, what else? I guess that's it. Actually, I was pretty quick. Sorry, I didn't have much more to say. So it kind of works, and I'm publishing some of these examples. I don't know if there is interest, I can put it in some GitHub every time it generates for a larger audience. People have been asking that. So, and also chairs have come to me because apparently no, we need to provide a summary, and some we are hardworking chairs and we like to write the summary, but some chairs don't care so much. So they will be happy about a LaTeX generated summary that they can give input to. So that this type of thing they have been asking as well. And yeah, that's it. It's again, side project. Don't expect high, deep evaluation. Thank you.
Olaf Kolkman, Internet Society. One of my side jobs is to produce an ornithology, which is a curated index of policy issues that we see in working groups. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, maybe I can go a level deeper and see what's happening in the working groups on working level and identify perhaps places where there are policy issues that, relate to the bigger thing. Do you think we can get there?
By policy issues, could you explain
just public policy issues. How does work relate to public policy fields? Things that policymakers might be interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you could. I mean, I don't know how well does an LLM understand the policy implications, but
I'm guessing that you probably would need to add a little bit of input to that and say, what are your policies? So, for example, if encryption or image-based sexual abuse is a thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, so
yeah.
I'm guessing that if you can provide some input like that, probably.
Yeah, I mean, like you can just pass more input. I mean, I mean, just like you could have email discussions or things like that, you could try to find similar related words and then based on that have the reference.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Laurent Chavalia, thanks. This is very nice work. Looking forward to use it. I'm also a chair. So. Just a question. Have you ever tried, Notebook LLM from Google? I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No.
Okay. Maybe you can have a look. I tried to use it. It's not working. I don't know why. Maybe I cannot fetch the. Okay. I'm just giving you the context. Notebook LLM is kind of running the LLM in a private context. So you just give these are the documents I want to have, and you can keep it, and then you interact with that.
Right.
So it's a bit more. You bound the context.
Right.
But I couldn't make it work to fetch, for instance, the draft or access for instance, the minutes on the data tracker. So maybe it's connectivity, yes. But it could be interesting because I think your work is generally applicable to IETF in general.
Yeah,
that's great. Then maybe you're used to have something a bit more, that is more portable and context specific. But just
right. I could have a look. Yeah. I mean, this was like a tool, as I said, it was mostly for me, and it takes very little effort in one line to just add another acronym for another working group. Basically, it's super. Once you have it implemented, it's trivial to add more. So it turned out to be 120 pages for the 120 something working groups in the IETF instead of 18 pages. But same for me. But thank you. I'll check it out.
Very good work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Colin Perkins. So this is awesome work. You say it occasionally takes a creative detour and invents some of the above. And sure, I mean, this is what LLMs do. I guess my question is, have you compared it to the human-generated minutes to see how often the people writing the minutes also take creative detours?
Yeah. And that was one of the reasons, because people have their biases. So I wanted more like another opinion of just what happened. And then you can also see and compare. But I mean, like the level of expertise of someone who is involved in a working group and knows every single detail of the draft is way deeper than, I mean, it's not comparable. This is good to get a high level overview, and then you read it and say, okay, this actual draft seems to be now more relevant than in the last IETF. I will look deeper and so on.
Is there any obvious way of comparing to judge what the accuracy rates are compared to other ways of generating these?
No, I mean, I don't work on that. I just do it. I just have a look. And
there are some metrics in the NLP community, but they are very subjective. I know they are known to be problematic, but there exist metrics.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Should I go next?
Yes, please. Go ahead, Carolina.
Hi, Jaime. Thank you for that presentation and for this very interesting work. I guess I had a comment and a question, and that's oftentimes I do some tracking at ITU, and people ask about overlaps between SDOs. So I was wondering whether you've expanded this to other SDOs, perhaps to track other IoT work that may be relevant for your working group, and just simply highlight also that this is something very interesting to maybe replicate with other SDOs and sort of compare notes as to how the sort of division of labor is working out across SDOs in areas where we're seeing a little overlap as well. For tracking certain issues. So thank you for the work. I think it's very interesting.
Thank you. Actually, I did try to pass some 3BP material, but then the pre-processing was a bit cumbersome, and then it was kind of a bit outside my field of expertise. So I just gave up a little bit on that. But in general, like if you have UTF-8 type of format, text is way easier. So I would encourage any spec maker to use not to use a binary format, please, to publish things. I know that 3BP has also now HTML, by the way, but I didn't look deeper into that. But other SDOs would be really useful, actually. Yeah, right.
Hi, Dhruv. From Huawei. I was just looking at your papers and also looking at what are the summaries that they generated for my working groups, which I chair. So what was very interesting was that it was very good at capturing at the high level what the discussion was happening, but not what was the conclusion. And every time that when we said that this is the final conclusion, which is what we hope that the minutes, human minutes should capture very specifically, and I checked multiple groups, that somehow always got missed.
Right.
Maybe because we don't tag it properly, or somehow it is missing. So something to look for as well. That is the action items or the conclusions. How do we make sure that they get captured properly?
So I mean, the output is still, I mean, the quality might not be the best. It's a side project for me. I don't know, but it's good enough for me. And then in core and in Lake and in other working groups that are IoT related, the minutes are super detailed actually. And in other groups, you just have like action points or like very thin summaries. You don't have, for instance, who is presenting, or so that is also that also affects. I can have a look and see if it gets better. I mean, I plan to generate, for instance, for this IETF and for further IETFs, and with the LaTeX also, and publish the LaTeX as well, so that you can maybe use it for some purpose as well.
Thanks. Another interesting thing that I saw was it made up a few things.
Yeah,
there is a BOF, NDD BOF. I was like, what is this BOF? It's new DNS delegation, what we call deleg. somehow it thought it's a new buff. So it's an interesting thing that
there will be. So I think hallucinations are, to my limited understanding, is intrinsic property of LLMs. The more data you give it, the deeper and more entrenched the hallucinations are. But I don't know how to get rid of them completely.
It's very interesting.
I think you have hundreds of thousands of people researching that topic right now.
Very interesting work. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to help. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Jaime.
Thank you.
Extremely interesting.
Thank you.
And last presentation from the session is from Kalija. Kalija, I don't know if you can hear me. Yes.
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello, Kalija. Sorry for the difficult hours of the day for you. You were.
And my colleague Day is also here. We're both champions. We're up at 2, 3 in the morning. How do we access the slides?
I think that you can share them from your side.
So we
Can
can
I
actually give
ask
you control of
slides?
the slides. So why don't you share them and oh, we can do that too.
Where do I click for that? So bear with us for a second.
So what do you want to do? We want to
Give her control. I never remember where is to give control.
no, so we
Yes.
need- I need to get rid. Hold on, I can do it here.
Yes.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the slides from here, and I'm going to give you control. So you should see slide
Yeah.
numbers and arrows at the bottom. So
Yeah, I do. Great. Thank you so much. So thanks for inviting us to present. We shared this summer about the fact that we were doing this research, and the good news is we have completed it. So the final title is The Remarkable Regenerative Patterns and Practices of the Internet Engineering Task Force. I put links to the presentation we gave this summer, which is some more background that I chose not to cover because we're presenting our results. So this is sort of the premise of our work. If code is law, from Lawrence Lessig's work, and coders follow protocols when they code, then SDOs that define protocols are in effect legislative bodies. And our question was, what are the legislative processes or protocols that the IETF uses for protocol creation? And we think this research and understanding this is really important because the internet is perhaps the ultimate digital public good and digital public infrastructure, and is an active digital commons, meaning that it is continually recreated by the people who are running the network, but also those folks here within the IETF that are moving the protocols for the future generations of the internet forward. We used 3 different pattern languages in our research. The group work stack for, which is a pattern language for bringing life to meetings and other gatherings. The WISE democracy pattern language developed by Tom Atlee and the Co-Intelligence Institute, and a pattern language on social permaculture within a book called Change Here Now. And we go into some depth in our research, explaining our methodology if you want to understand it more. This is a picture of the map, one of the maps we made with our observations from being at 7 days of the meeting this summer, along with all the patterns that we were observing. So all the green stickies on this wall are different patterns. This is the one slide about the first part of the report. Day, do you want to briefly summarize that section?
And the challenge here is to not read the slide. Don't read
Explain
the slide.
hexagon.
Yeah. Yeah, the essential idea here is that the entire process feeds on itself and builds on itself in a cyclic way. There's a basic kind of core identity that comes from this sort of origin story, the beginnings of the IETF. It informs this culture that shapes the process, that forms the governance, that informs the tooling, which becomes an embodiment of all of the aforementioned. And then it's that tooling that helps to structure the knowledge that's generated that informs kind of the renewal of the identity. So it's got this kind of ongoing process. The other thing I guess that I'll say about this diagram is that the purpose is both kind of at the core and renewed by this, but is the surrounding context of complexity that that was the original condition of what the internet was being made for, and the conditions of creating it. So I think that's enough about that.
Cool, thank you. In the second part of our report, we look at some key questions, and these were in the abstract that I shared with you. So how does the IETF distribute governance, and how does it embody key patterns in the WISE democracy pattern language? Those of you who are longtime participants in the IETF know this history probably, but I also talked to many more recent participants who had no idea about this history. So I think like your own storytelling about how you came to be and doing it more is important. This is a slide from David Clark's presentation in the summer of 1992, which was a time of upheaval and governance process. And it really named the elephant in the room, which was the protocols that the TCP/IP was competing with, OSI, and also the challenges of governance as the organization and the network grew. And the key distinction is that
Can I interrupt you just for a second? There is a question. What is a pattern language? And I guess that maybe clarifying that early on would help some of the people in the audience. Sorry for the interruption.
If folks really want to understand that, please click on to the slides that we gave you this summer where we covered that, and it's extensively in the document. So pattern language is, the first one was developed for architecture, and it's a hyperlinked network of patterns that are observed in the real world. So the Internet Engineering Task Force structure significantly shifted pre-1992 and post-1992, and it went from a 4-layer hierarchy where the ultimate decision maker or approver of RFCs was the Internet Architecture Board to one where the IESG became the final decider. The Internet Architecture Board took on different roles in terms of interacting with the outside world, and the NOMCOM was innovated. And this NOMCOM innovation is what I think is most unique about IETF governance. And it was created in response to to fulfill this description, which is that all the working groups would be open, and those that had restricted membership would have nomination and selection through an open process. And this rebellion that happened between sort of like senior leadership and the engineering body was, I interpreted as a kind of not about us without us moment. So this is our diagram of sort of the NOMCOM process. So you're using sortition, which is a key pattern in the WISE democracy pattern language, to select the deciders of picking key leadership roles within the organization. There's also privacy guarantees, both for the feedback from the body about nominees for roles, along with privacy guarantees to the nomination committee for their deliberation. And another thing that, and deliberation is another key pattern that is practice in this process. So this unique leadership selection is was one of the things that struck me early on, and also embodies several of these key patterns from the wise democracy pattern language. Another thing that is observed through this is that there is a consensual hierarchy that is created. This is a pattern from the social permaculture pattern language. There are 3 levels maximum in that they name, and also like rotating leadership and transparent communication. So we'll get to this in a sec, but the level of transparency within the IETF and its processes is incredibly high. Another articulation on the slide is that power must be shared. And when we look at the IETF kind of diagram of itself, this was drawn by Jay Daly in 2022, is that there are these 3 levels of hierarchy, and the top level, there isn't any one of those entities that sits above the other ones. They all have clearly articulated roles and have mutual accountability across that like top layer. The other thing that IETF has done to facilitate its embodiment of the patterns is tools and that enable the transparency. So this process that you have for RFC creation is arguably has lots of steps in it. I don't want to say it's complex. It's pretty simple once you understand it, but there's a lot of things that need to happen. All of that has tooling for it, and which is part of what makes it possible to do it. And this is another diagram I drew of making sense of both the IESG and IAB and all their interconnected roles and what they do. Again, all of that's made possible by this tooling infrastructure that you guys have created and invested in so significantly. And these the tooling, your unique governance process allows for and embodies these patterns. There's holistic leadership and governance dynamics because of the ongoing rotation of leadership and how you choose them. There's collective distributed intelligence in terms of the wisdom that is embodied in the work going on at the working groups, but also for the overall whole. And there's collective wise governance, wise oversight of governance. Because everything's so transparent and all the roles are so clear, people do what they're supposed to in given roles. And if they don't, people are pretty graceful in pulling them back onto center. There's local subsidiarity, meaning like you're putting work in the appropriate level and place. There's constraints and concentrated power. That's what that whole sort of top level of governance in the organization has, a ton of sort of mutual accountability across it. There is a group mind that is getting fed new information through all of the different practices and processes you do. And there's inclusive stakeholder governance. Within a week of the IETF, you do some really good things. There's a strong sense of place at IETF meetings. I have more patterns about this that we covered this summer. I just chose to highlight some that we didn't mention necessarily then. The plenary on Wednesday brings the whole system into the room together and allows for whole system conversation. There are rituals of appreciation, celebration, and grief, memorializing folks, giving awards, thanking everybody for their hard work. These are all part of what makes it a live and vibrant community. The grounding in running code for both technical protocols, community leadership, and governance protocols is really key. The fact that you're willing to experiment and iterate in new processes, like the whole experiment with all dispatch has sort of been fascinating to watch over the last year. The work going on trying to understand the meaning of the RFC with the it's too early in the morning. The RFC series working group, and also just all the work happening in protocol development. There's a willingness to experiment and learn, and also learn how to learn. That's sort of this iterative loop of like experimentation on yourselves to see what's working and not working, and iterating your process over time. And I think there's this question that we had coming in, and others do too, is how is an organization that is so open capable of such coherence? And I think you create very clear boundaries and you set clear intention and purpose. Groups have charters. People in leadership have clear role definition. And we came up with this term to describe what we saw. There's a strong group proprioception, meaning people know where they are in the organization, what the purpose of a meeting is, what the purpose of whatever group is holding the meeting is, and they understand how it connects to the whole. So this is just highlighting the patterns that are present in setting appropriate boundaries. You have a strong definition, mission statement, which I won't read out here, but open process, technical competence, volunteer code, rough consensus and running code, and protocol ownership. This is a diagram I drew. I sort of overlaid all the RFCs I could find about your process onto your structure. This may be helpful for the newbies. I also overlaid like all the RFCs related to RFC production onto the flow that I made of RFC production. And I also made this list of sort of various articulations of specific people's specific roles within the IETF and the RFCs that apply to them. So it's this combination of clarity of where you are in the group. This is an example too of like IAB connections and external responsibilities. The IAB is doing this cognition or discernment about what's going on in the wider world beyond just the IETF. And it's in doing so is aligning with many of the patterns in both the group work stack and the Wise Democracy pattern language. This is all of the IAB's connections and responsibilities. This is the IESG's connections and responsibilities. And then I put it all, and this is sort of the things that both of them have responsibility. And I just put all of these in. Folks can look at the slides later to just say that all of these entities have clarity, like people in them are not confused about where they are. And that group intelligence and proprioception is part of what makes the institution, if you can call the IETF an institution, work. And I see there's several questions, so I'll just finish on this. I think this other pattern stood out to me quite strongly is joyful communal labor. So the organization is coming together and it's like a giant work party for a week and everybody's having a good time. And you're there because you want to be there, you're volunteering to be there, and you're celebrating what you're doing together. And that's really part of what also makes it work. And these are just some examples that I articulated. Let's shift and go to questions.
Thank you very much. I see Andrew, Olaf, and Rich on the queue.
Hi, Andrew Camping speaking. Thank you for that really interesting research. All amazingly positive. You could surmise from that it's fantastic. And many of the aspects are, as you've quite rightly highlighted. I'd be interested to know, and this may have been out of scope for your study, did you come across things that you felt, based on this approach, could or should be improved? What could we do better? Thank you.
It's a great question. I think things that you were trying to do better, I witnessed get better. So like the newbie introduction from my first IETF to the fourth one, much improved. I think the IAB has an opportunity to use more innovative processes in its workshops. That was like one thing that I noticed could use improvement. Even the fact that that's the question you asked is an embodiment of the culture of the IETF, which is always trying to figure out how to be better and is quite self-critical in a productive way. Do you have any thoughts, Day?
I would just like to kind of acknowledge that to some degree, because the lens of the research was through these pattern languages, and they are by and large positive patterns, that then you end up seeing that through glasses colored that way to some degree. It's an odd term, but you might have heard the term anti-pattern. It's not really an anti-pattern, it's just a pattern that has negative results. These are generally patterns that have positive results. You could conceivably create, or add to your glossaries some anti-patterns, and then similarly look at how those were showing up, and you would probably get, some other interesting outcomes from looking at it that way.
Hi, Rich Sauls, former NOMCOM chair, working group chair. I find this really fascinating. The use of patterns you had in one of the intro slides was, came from architecture, heavily used in software development, and now seeing it being used in social organizations is interesting. I got some reading to do. Do you guys need to replace a fire alarm, or is there one here that's chirping?
It's in my house, and I think it's in the apartment next door. Sorry.
All right. No, not at all. I'm just glad to know that we've got resolved where it is. Previous people who have looked at the IETF from the outside, from their perspective, weren't received as well. Corinne Cass, right? She got slaughtered because she had some fairly negative observations about the way the IETF worked in the communities that it was built around. So this is, it's an interesting counterbalance. I'm a big Corinne supporter. I think this stuff is also very great. And as Andrew had first asked, one thing that would be really useful, and it's nice to hear that we're asking it is also useful, is to figure out things that could be improved. But be aware that internal criticism works well. "Quote unquote" external criticism tends not to work as well in the IETF. So, but thank you
Sure.
for this. Sure, but thank you for this stuff. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I think there are, I come to the IETF with from an interesting place. So I've been leading a technical community focused on digital identity for 20 years. We meet twice a year. We use open space technology, which in its own way embodies many of the patterns in these pattern languages. And quite a lot of work that happens at IIW is also happening within the IETF and in various working groups. So I come from high performance technical community. And so when I showed up in the IETF, I sort of knew what I was looking at, which is an even more high performance technical community. And also the fact that your meetings are so well organized and run just really intrigued me to sort of get to finding tools to explain what I was seeing. And I think the patterns themselves, like, we haven't made it public, but it could be possible to do, is actually basically to do the research, we have documents that have each of the patterns and then writing about where we saw the patterns, right? So the patterns are a way to go to look at your own processes and sort of understand where the patterns are happening. And you can over 50 years, you've amplified a lot of good patterns, which is why things work well. Do you want to go ahead, Day?
I just wanted to loop it into what I saw as kind of part of the central point that was being made there about internal versus external criticism, or the way that, this sounded very positive and other things have sounded very negative. I think I'd just like to kind of say that in many cases, a positive pattern that exists or is in use has particular effects, whereas if somebody who's bringing a critique is saying, hey, look, something's not working here, this is broken in this way, I would say almost every time that there's something that's not working, there's some positive pattern that could be amplified or used again or used more or leaned into in some way that could address whatever the negative critique is. And so then it's like a coming together of this sort of internal, the familiar, and what you're already doing, in a way that meets some critique that's coming from outside, and maybe creates a sense of common ground where you could start speaking in the same terms about the things that you were looking to kind of co-evolve together. So I see it could actually be a constructive way forward of meeting critiques, if you could get speaking in the same pattern languages about it, perhaps.
Yeah.
Very well. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation and your answers to the questions. And thank you very much for making the effort at these remarkably difficult hours for yours. And thank you everybody for the attendance and for the questions. And I hope to see you all in the next IETF 122. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Ya está. Estamos aquí hasta la 1 de la tarde.
¿Ha estado bien, no?
Estuvo bien, no, lo mejor fue que interacción.
Sí, sí, sí.
En todas.
En todas. Y además,
sí.
creía que iba a interesar a muchísima gente. De hecho, se me ocurre una forma de...
Good trip. Got here okay.
Les he dicho hola.
You just come in today? Or you've been
Les
here
he dicho hola.
yesterday?
Pues ISO tiene graph. Podríamos proponer una, que básicamente sea un poco su idea.